Hi, I'm Anjali Alapat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 3, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, video games, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. We're kicking off this season with debut novelist Prashanth Srivatsa. Prashanth's first novel, The Spice Gate, is filled with complex world building and features an all too familiar socio-economic hierarchy. Prashanth has woven together a lush new world filled with magic, spice, and political intrigue. He also tackles difficult issues of caste, class, and religion with nuance and empathy. Join us as we discuss South Asian pirates, white savior complexes, the best biryani, the many aspects of resistance, and generational trauma. We're very excited for him because the Spice Gate launches this week. Hi, Prashanth. Thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx.
Hi, Anjali. Thank you so much for having me here. It's great.
And congratulations on the Spice Gate. I know it's been kind of a long road to getting this book out there. Are you excited?
Thank you. Yes, very much. I mean, it's been a crazy ride. Publishing is a very patience testing and demanding process. So to see something as small as a bud growing and fattening and trimming and fattening again to finally see it arrive at my doorstep is a very enriching experience, to say the least.
And, I typically ask this, I really want to know, how did you get started as a writer? Can you tell us a bit about your journey? Did you always want to be a writer?
I wouldn't say always, but I think the ideas had come in pretty soon. I think it was way back in 10th or 11th standard when I used to go for this IIT coaching. I was not good at it. And my friend and I, we used to sit at the back. And while the professors there used to teach us physics or chemistry or whatever, we would be engaged in world building. That's why I did not clear the IIT entrance exam, but that's also why I became a writer.
I feel like there's a large portion of India's writers whose origin story involves the IIT training process.
Absolutely. I feel like IITs either make you realize that this is definitely what I want to do, or make you realize that I want to go as far away from this as possible. These polarities are what brings out the diversity in us.
Individuality rising out of the universality of engineering college or whatever it is.
That's how it was. And we had multiple sources for our inspiration. Back then, we used to have animes, we used to watch Naruto and Dragon Ball Z, we used to read Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and all of this used to come together for my friend and I. And we used to kind of build our own worlds, and slowly we started writing very rough drafts. While there are hydrocarbons and organic chemistry that's being taught in front of us, there is secondary worlds building on paper on the last row. I never really wrote a complete story then, not at least for another few years. But then I realized that's something that I don't want to stop doing, even if it was all half-baked and half-assed at that moment. So eventually, I did get to writing short stories and sending it along to venues with tons and tons and tons of rejection, and people indirectly telling me, never to my face, but indirectly in the form of all these rejections, that I'm not good enough. And maybe I was not back then. Maybe I am a better writer now. I'd never know. But eventually the idea for the Spice Gate came up, and that's where we are.
Hey, look who's laughing now. Seriously,
Yeah, I'll keep it quiet until the book comes out and is received by everyone, as well as I'm hoping it is. Until then, there's no laughter. There's just nice, cute little smile that's going to be like, thank you for buying this.
You're so much more measured and well-behaved than me. I feel like I would have already sent out slightly spiteful and petty copies of the advanced reader copy.
I can still do that, actually.
Hey, never say that I don't give people good ideas, But having read The Spice Gate, it's a really rich story. So it makes sense to me that you were quite obsessed with world building early on. But, were there any books or stories that you kind of read growing up that influenced how you think about fantasy and writing now?
Definitely, definitely. I think the usual, I would say, see, for me, while growing up, I did not have a lot of reading background. Like, I was not reading anything up until when I was like 14 or 15 years old. Until then, reading was alien to me. I did not have a very encouraging family who were like, I feel like you should read more fiction. I started with Harry Potter because my neighbor, who is a year older than me, he was seen roaming around with a Harry Potter book in my apartment. And he was like, hey, you should read this. I was like, sure, I can give it a shot. And that's how it started. And from there, I realized that, wow, this fantasy thing is really nice. And, things expanded. I really got into a lot of the Rings, the Earthsea cycle, and soon into A Song of Ice and Fire, Malazan, Robin Hobb, all your standard fare of white Western authors with their Eurocentric and American views and worlds. But they had such an influence on how I view the world, how I view society, how I want my own imagination to develop. Definitely laid the foundation for me as a fantasy writer. Over the years, obviously, my reading significantly widened, and I wouldn't always give credit to only fantasy novels or science fiction novels to the writer that I am. Like, one of the most important books that really had a huge impact on me was Rohinton Mistri's A Fine Balance. The impact that book had on me is still felt in every small work that I write. And even back when I was in college, I had started reading Ambedkar, I had started reading Periyar, I had started reading books about politics and all of those things. And all of that, coupled with a very deep fascination for fantasy and science fiction that had over the years just been political views along with fantasy as a genre that I came to deeply love. I definitely feel like I don't want to give all the credit to the fantasy books, even though they are still my first love.
You've cited a lot of really interesting books that you've read, and it's unsurprising to me in the light of that your own writing deals with a lot of social hierarchy and kind of themes of injustice in that sense. So obviously, it had a very deep impact on you.
Absolutely. So that is again credit to a lot of pioneers in that field, including social thinkers like Ambedkar, Periyar, including even fantasy authors like Ursula Le Guin, who Left Hand of Darkness was one of the first books that I read way back in college. And that book completely changed my perspective of how I view so many things, including gender, identity, everything. And couple that with the kind of political readings that I was doing, and I realized how important social justice was to me, and that no matter what I wrote, there would be a chief conflict of people in distress, people who are oppressed, being uplifted out of that particular oppression and coming into their own. My worry was always in the form of how am I even worthy enough to find a solution? Am I even worthy enough to tell this story? Even today, I kind of, when I look back on the Spice Gate and I think about that in the sense of like, am I the right person to tell this story? But I did feel so strongly about these kind of topics and it just all fell into place.
I think that's a very interesting theme as well. Like, who gets to tell these stories? And I feel like you touch on that in your book also. But, before we really dive into the Spice Gate, I mean, I did want to talk a bit about your influences and stuff. And I mean, you mentioned obviously Harry Potter and like Ursula Le Guin. I feel like the Left Hand of Darkness revolutionized quite a few people. A lot of people I know are like, have you read that one? That one changed my life. But were there any others?
Yeah, definitely. Dune was one of the books that really caught my interest when I started reading it. It was, again, one of the books that was like terrified me when I looked at it for the first time, like nearly 800 pages of it. But the premise, the name itself, Dune, the old cover that is there in one of the secondhand copies that I had bought, all of it just like dragged me into its depths. There are obviously some very obvious similarities between the spiciness of Dune versus the Spice Gate. There was always that particular influence that kind of seeped in. And Dune, very similar to Spice Gate, also deals with a critique of colonialism. Also, not just a critique of colonialism, but also a critique of a white savior. And that is something that Dune was the first book which kind of opened my eyes to that theme over a long time ago. I was raised on these white Western fantasy authors, which was always about heroes and a group overcoming almighty odds and, the victory of light over darkness. So when Dune began in a similar tone, I was a little, okay, one more of it. Let's see how that goes. And then that gets completely inverted as you go deeper into the novel. There's a lot more nuance to Dune, but it's a wonderful critique of the savior narrative. And that deeply influenced me in how I wrote the Spice Gate. And that's one thing, because it was that part of Dune that was a bigger influence than Spice itself. Spice was not the key influence because the way Spice is used in the Spice Gate versus how Spice is important in Dune are entirely different. In Dune, it's more like a resource that is, sorry, how do I put this?
Basically, the world runs on that particular spice in the sense that there is no intergalactic travel or anything like that without it.
It's like a fuel. It is a fuel of sorts for your world to run. And as a result, it becomes a very desirable thing to own. While in the Spice Gate, it's pretty much something that the world is obsessed with, but because of its ubiquity, it's not something that is felt as like an obsession or an addiction by the very people who use it. It's felt by us who are reading it. It's felt by me when I'm writing it that I am writing this intentionally as something that needs to be felt as an obsession. But for the people, it's pretty much commonplace. Spice is everywhere for them, and everyone has the spice, but there is a social hierarchy in terms of how that spice is accessible to different people and how it is exploited. So here, unlike Dune, in the Spice Gate, there is labor exploitation, while in Dune, it is resource exploitation and extractivism.
I also wanted to ask you how you felt about it today. Like, given that now you're a writer yourself, you've read a lot more, you've seen a lot more, and do you think it still holds up?
I think it definitely holds up. It's a huge critique of not just the white savior narrative, but like the entire Western imperialist attitude that is still very hugely prevalent today. We see that in Israel versus Palestine, we see that in Russia versus Ukraine, we see that in many other conflicts across the world where countries like the US still have a very strong grip on the local politics. And that is something that the Dune tried to dismantle over several books. Obviously, the book Dune itself begins with a prophecy of a white savior. And people need to really sit tight and go through often uneven books in Dune to get to the full picture. But I think it's more relevant than before. And I imagine, unless the world changes very drastically, it will go through in the future.
We have talked a bit about white saviorism, but also I think quite an interesting thing about Dune is that from the beginning, Paul kind of knows he is the savior. He's very aware of who he is, but there is obviously a sense of reluctance to take on that mantle, and for very valid reasons. I mean, he obviously doesn't want to kill millions of people. But I found his whole character arc and development extremely interesting because he starts somewhere with very good intentions, and then I do kind of feel that he has the noblest of intentions as he goes along.
But I think that was also a very intentional aspect of his characterization because unlike Amir in the Spice Gate, like Paul is always aware of his potential to do the damage that he fears. He knows that should he wish to, he can do what he wants because he is purported to be the savior of that world. He never doubts that he's capable of it. Unlike Amir, his belief is that he is a nobody. He has seen his people constantly be put down, and for him to rise is an impossible thought in his head. That how far can we even go? Right? I don't want to give out spoilers for the book, but his journey certainly evolves from the time of his initial desire to get his family to safety. So I think There are some interesting parallels in how we choose to save our people and who we are in the scheme of things.
So before we kind of go further, I mean, because we've talked quite a bit about the Spice Gate already, but I think our listeners could benefit with a little bit of a summary. Could you tell us what the book is about?
Oh, that's the worst question you can ask an author.
Get used to it.
Authors hate answering, what is your book about? I don't know. Why don't you read it?
Hey, you're going to go on a book tour.
I know. I've been thinking about it a lot and I've been rehearsing what I need to tell, etc., etc. So, in short, the Spice Gate is the journey of freedom for young man named Amir, who lives in a world where his kingdom and 7 other kingdoms are all very far flung from each other, and the land between them is entirely inhospitable, and they can only reach the other worlds through mystical portals known as the Spice Gate. And these Spice Gates are accessible only by few people. And while it sounds like a thing of privilege, it's actually the other way around. The most oppressed people are the ones who are able to travel through the Spice Gates from one kingdom to another, and they are made to be the laborers who carry the goods and services from one place to the other. And passing through the gate is like a very painful thing. The Spice Gates, while they give you the benefit of moving from one world to the other, it extracts a lot from you, and it is considered to be something that is a little polluted. It is considered to be painful. And as a result, Amir, who has been tormented by the Spice Gates all this while, fears that his brother is going to go through the same thing. And his family and he have suffered long enough under the burden of the Spice Gate, and he wants out. And the Spice Gate is basically the journey of how he discovers his freedom and whether he is able to realize it, and how the world itself turns out to be at stake in that journey.
Thank you. That was a great summary. I don't think you need to be afraid.
But I'll tell you something. I spoke so much, but I didn't tell anything about spices. See, there's always something that gets left out.
I will ask you about spices, I promise. In fact, my next question was going to be, what inspired the Spice Gates, and why did you choose spices as a very specific thing to kind of power this world?
I think it's a mixture of a little bit of coincidence as well as a huge fascination with the kitchen. I love cooking. And I have this nice wooden, like very old wooden spice box at home, which is always filled with this variety of things that I use in my cooking. And cooking it's a lot like an old skill. It's something that I learned over the last 5 or 6 years, but still, it's something that I enjoy quite a lot. And the inception of the Spice Gate was also around the time when I was learning a lot about the history of the Indian Ocean. Right? So that was something that always fascinated me more than, say, the colonial period or the Mughal period of India. The whole history of the Indian Ocean was something that hugely fascinated me. I was reading about the Coromandel coast. I was reading about the old Silk routes, the whole spice trades, all the way from Rome on one side to China on the other, and how the different ports of India were such important spots in the trading, and just opened my eyes to how huge a role our country played in some of the most dominant trading routes in the world, far long before all the things in history we do talk about in school and everywhere else. So that was hugely fascinating for me. And right around that time, when I was reading about the old spice routes along the southern coast of India, and this idea just emerged, of the Spice Gate, about how trade was both possible in a unique world where spices kind of dominate. And I wanted to write this portal fantasy initially. I don't think the Spice Gate that you read now is the same structure that it once was. It was like a nice, fun portal fantasy kind of an idea that was there in my head, where you throw some spice and just move through mystical gates. That still happens, but but yeah, the severity of the social issues were not prevalent in my initial fun ideas. But yeah, that's how the Spice Gate was born.
And despite the Spice Gate being set in the secondary world, there are a lot of very recognizable elements, especially if you're an Indian. Can you tell us a bit about how the world building process happened for you? How did it all come into being?
The one thing that I was certain was that I wanted distinct worlds or kingdoms for each spice, right? And back then I was reading a lot about spices. I was doing a lot of research. I knew how spices would grow. I started trying to grow some of them in my house as well. Whenever I start thinking of a story, the first thing that comes is like the map, because like fantasy authors have this crazy addiction towards maps that they just cannot get over. It was no different for me. So, and I realized that this map is nothing like how any other story that I have read, because usually in maps I draw like these random stuff and I start labeling cities and mountains and rivers, and in the Spice Gate nothing was coming together because everything was all distinct and separate. And that's when I realized that maybe it's meant to be such that these places aren't supposed to be connected at all, that whatever is the space between them is just absolutely inhospitable, and that the only way is through spice gates. So that's where the element of the spice gate as a concept rather came into being. And from there, I think the world building was pretty straightforward. And I knew that, I mean, for me, the whole South Indian cuisines, the terminologies across, and when I say South Indian cuisines, not just your typical upper caste cuisines, but cuisines across the spectrum of society, everywhere from the streets of Tamil Nadu and Kerala to your fancy manner cuisines, everything is something that was familiar to me, and I wanted to exploit that as much as possible in narrating the story. I think you'll definitely find, if you're a South Indian, there'll be a lot that you will find familiar in the Spice Gate.
No, definitely. And I think there's a lot to be said for a lot of the food that you evoke, which runs the gambit from like, as you said, sweets to like biryani, which is, I feel, kind of universal in India and in South Asia.
It's the most contentious dish. Like, biryani is always like, which biryani is the best? Is it Hyderabadi? Is it Kolkata? Is it Lucknow? Is it Ambur? It's an endless debate.
Nothing gets Indians worked up more than asking who has the best biryani recipe. This is where World War III begins,
Absolutely.
And in the book, the entire social structure is based around the scriptures of the mouth, which is the god that all the kingdoms recognize. So why choose to tell a religious story? Because at the core of it, that's kind of what governs this whole social structure and power system.
Yeah. So religion was important because the elimination of the oppression of Amir and his people, in my view, was not possible without the elimination of religion. It's a very Ambedkarite view, which he kind of propounded even in his book, The Annihilation of Caste. It's a very controversial book. It's a book that was very close to my heart, and it's closer to the heart of a lot of people who are, going through that. So the elimination of religion, which in our world is said to be very utopian, ideal. I don't know if it's ever going to happen or it will happen or it should happen. There are arguments for it and against it. But in the Spice Gate, there is not just a religion, but there is a tangible God, right? There is a tangible God that has to be overcome. So now we're getting into spoilers territory. So this entire discussion needs to be precluded with a spoiler alert.
Yes. Anyone who is listening, go read the Spice Gate before coming here and hearing the in-depth discussion.
Yeah. So religion was absolutely essential because its destruction is also absolutely essential for the freedom of Amir and his people. It's not enough to just want people to have their minds changed. We can all wish that, hey, everyone, all of you just turn over a new leaf, and from tomorrow, we're going to treat everyone equally. We're going to ignore 2000 years of our mindset that has been molded by scriptures and heritage and whatnot. It's not going to work as much as we want it to. So that's why the Spice Gate is a fantasy novel.
And there are, as you said, very concrete parallels between our world and the one that you've created. And especially when you talk about caste, which appears very strongly in this book. And your hero, your protagonist, Amir, he belongs to the lowest rung of this social hierarchy. He's a gate caste, which means that he has the power or the destiny, rather, to use the spice gates. But as you said, has ended up being exploited because of his abilities. and discriminated against because, according to the scriptures of this world, they are the lowest of low. And why was it so important to you that Amir was a gatecast and that other than a very few, other characters, most of the central movers and shakers in this book were from the gatecast community?
By the way, this book was initially written in the first person. And as I kept writing, I was like, okay, I mean, this is great, but there was eventually a change of mind, and I moved towards the third person because, on the one hand, on a very positive hand, I was getting too close to Amir. And on the second hand, I realized that I needed to kind of exercise some level of distance from him, and that was best achieved from a third person perspective. So it was important for Amir to be a gatecast because he's the one who sees the reality of the eight worlds, right? He's the only one who is able to be in all of the different places and kingdoms because the others are living in their own worlds. They know how the world works, but the ground realities are much different, right? And Amir is the one who is coincidentally or not able to, again, we are entering into spoiler territory, discover that there is more to this world than just the eight kingdoms. Right? It was absolutely essential that it was him because the moment he discovers that little more, it is also like juxtaposed with the fact that he is in essence a powerless man. Right? For someone who is able to find out and discover newer and newer things about this world, to be having that realization that I am also powerless was something that I wanted to explore, and how that kind of comes together. In this book, he's constantly struggling against his own inability to change things, to have agency, right? So his agency is always exercised in the limits of his own imagination. Like, okay, this is as much as I can go. He already has achieved a lot, right? He's in love with a princess and he thinks he can join a band of pirates. So all of these are like already lofty things and going on in his life. But even when he realizes that there are things even beyond that, he suddenly realizes how insignificant and powerless he is, and he starts doubting whether he can or cannot do all these things. And he fights against the things that he needs to do that will get him free at first, right? So there's a contradiction over there, and that contradiction is only possible if Amir is a gatecast.
I think that makes a lot of sense because also there is a sense of like, your view of the world is limited by what you and maybe generations before you were given or even allowed to dream or aspire to. And there is in the book a lot of very real discrimination in big ways and little ways. And it like comes up constantly, which I think is a very realistic depiction of caste. And there's a lot of elements of political thriller to the book also. Like there's a lot of machinations going on, and poor Amir really doesn't know what's happening 99% of the time, I would say. So I think that also adds to the confusion in his journey because he's just this random kid who's been kind of really completely by chance falls into this political plot. And of course, he sees so much more than he ever dreamt he would, but he's always a sort of prisoner of circumstance. And I do find him very fascinating. Was it a deliberate choice to kind of keep him ignorant?
Yeah, I think rather than it being intentional, I think the world is designed in such a way that he cannot know more. I think Karim Bhai does know more despite being a gatecast, but Karim Bhai's knowledge comes at a cost, right? He has tied himself to the above folks, and he offers himself as a conduit between the gatecast and the above folk. And he says that, hey, I can't go beyond this. This is who I am. I know so much, but this is the price I have to pay for knowing so much.
And you've brought up one of my favorite characters, who is Karim Bhai.
Oh, I love him.
He's Amir's, I would say, father figure / mentor, who used to be friends with Amir's own father before he disappeared. And initially, when we're introduced to him, like you said, he sounds like someone who's kind of given up. He's resigned to his place in the hierarchy. He's always trying to advise Amir to keep his head down and appease the overseers kind of thing. But actually, as the book goes on, you realize that he is the wild card. More than Amir, I think Karim Bhai might be the real hero of this book.
Karim was a cockroach. You just can't do anything to him.
I mean, I don't want to give away too much, but there is a point where Amir is like depths of despair. He thinks that's it. Like he's just about survive something catastrophic. And then like he looks up and there's Karim Bhai being like, hello. I laughed out loud. I was like, but why the decision to have someone like Karim Bhai? Because to me, he's a very different kind of gatecast to Amir. So I think he does provide a kind of foil for Amir, but also a foil for every other person we see in the book.
Yeah, because see, Karim Bhai is, as you said, like he seems like a person who has given up largely because of his past in how his relationship was with Amir's father and what eventually happened. And over the years, he has been seeing that this is something that we just cannot fight. So he's the damage limitation kind of a guy, right? Like, let's not make things worse for ourselves. You know what? Me being in the palace, me being in the shadows of these powerful people, let me try to make your life a little better, here and there. Whatever, troubles you have, just tell me and I'll try to solve these little problems because I have some influence. But let's not aim too high in life. He's that kind of a guy because he's very practical. He has seen horrors in the past. He's lost people. He knows that if the gatecast kind of reach beyond their station, it's almost always leads in tragedy. So that's why he kind of keeps a check on Amir's recklessness. Deep down, Karim Bhai, if given the opportunity or if given a pathway, would do the same things that Amir is doing. He is a wonderful character because at some points, because he sees the path ahead of someone's liberation, it might not be his own, it might be Amir's or his family's liberation. And the moment he sees the path ahead, Karim Bhai is like, let's go do this. And everywhere else, he's like, okay, you know what, let's just keep our heads low and do our jobs. But the moment he sees something, he has that experience to guide Amir towards that decision.
And I mean, though Karim Bhai is his kind of father figure during the course of the book, Amir's own father is actually casts a very long shadow, I would say, even though now Amir knows he's dead. But we discover that he was also a revolutionary in his own way. And he eventually succeeds in leaving behind this life that he hates, but the consequence of which is that he leaves his family behind as well. And Amir then becomes, I guess, the man of the house and deeply resents his father for, I would say, succeeding and failing at the same time, And Amir's reactions and actions in the book are constantly guided by his fathers before him. And could you tell us a bit about why you decided to make that relationship the way it is?
I think it was very crucial for Amir to have that kind of a relationship with his father because Amir grew in his view of what the Spice Gates represented. During his initial years of living with his father, it was his father who was a revolutionary, while Amir was someone who was excited to set out as a spice carrier. He was looking forward to traveling through the gates and into the Eight Kingdoms. So that relationship with his father and to what it led to losing his father, to the father's death, everything, and the years that followed, and all the way to his brother's growing, and to the same time where his brother is going to be inducted into the spice gate, to the trade, he realizes how or what his father had wanted. He still resents his father for leaving, but there is at some point an unspoken understanding of what his father was trying to do. Right? So it shaped him in some ways that he will probably not like to admit, that he himself wanted these lofty ambitions of escaping and getting his family to safety.
It is one of the most interesting relationships in the book, I would say, because, and I think women in the book also play a very interesting role because a lot of the strongest characters are women. Kalai, who is one of my, I want to say she's one of the most interesting characters because she struggles so much, because she is Amir's companion, but in a very reluctant way. Like she's kind of assigned to keep an eye on him. She doesn't like him very much. He thinks that she's like this silly rich girl. And even though she's essentially, I think, a one woman army, she still doesn't know much about the world outside. And they constantly challenge each other. I like to think that they emerge as sort of friends at the end of it. But it's also very interesting because of her religious beliefs. She actually was inducted into a holy order. So she really holds the scriptures at a very high regard. And she is very naive in that she believes, hey, the scriptures don't say anything about discriminating against lower caste people. So she's always trying to say, oh, this is not God's fault or the scripture's fault, it's people's fault, which is true. I mean, of course, it's part of it, but a very real part of it is that there is a tangible God who says these things, you know, it's not coming from nowhere. So why create someone like her?
Yeah, I think Kale was the character that I absolutely enjoyed writing because I really wanted to show the transformation of, I wouldn't say a fanatic, but someone who was deeply religious and who believed in the religious order to someone who actually changes her views about how that religion affects society. I think what she does is give Amir some perspective on how or why society is the way it is. Amir is able to deduce a lot more from, from the interlinkages from the scriptures and how the lived reality is. But I think from Kale, he learns a lot more about why things are the way they are. He gets pieces of this here and there. When he travels to Elindi, he learns a bit more about the god. He learns a bit more about the religion. But with Kale, he wants to show her how this religion is not right. He wants someone on whom he can project this particular anger that he has against his own oppression and proving Kale wrong because he sees a weakness in Kale throughout the book, like right from the start when he meets her and he sees a certain weakness and a reluctance in her, which he always feels he can exploit. It could be related to her family, it could be related to her faith, but he sees that weakness. He sees her doubting certain things at certain times and he wants to exploit that. And it kind of gives him a little more purpose in his journey. And I think Kale is in many ways like the perfect companion to Amir because there is also so much that she learns and is needed for her to grow and challenge her own upbringing. That is crucial to the novel because in the end, everything that happens because of both Kale being very obstinate in her belief and her eventual letting go. And yeah, I had such tremendous fun writing Kale. Just such a fun character.
Another character that looms large through the book is Harini, who is this upper caste heir to the throne who Amir somehow meets and falls in love with. And despite all odds, she appears to be in love with him as well. And I would say she looms large just because not that he gets that much time to talk to her or spend time with her during the course of the book, but he's always looking towards a future with her in it. But it is incredibly difficult odds, impossible odds, really, to imagine someone who's a Maharani and this guy who is considered the lowest of low. But why choose to have that kind of dichotomy? Like, why put them at such opposing ends of the scale?
This was something I gave a lot of thought, like even while I was drafting the novel as well as after that. And I realized that the success, or rather the initial success of his relationship with Harini gave him the impetus to hope that discrimination can be overcome. That the love that she naturally felt for him was evidence of how he need not be oppressed. So it was something that gave him a lot of hope, even though she could be an exception. She might not be in the majority, but it was something so personal and close to his heart, which is why he is so hurt when she is keeping secrets from him in the start, when she suddenly starts to behave like everyone else. So that's why it affects him so much, and that's why it was also important to have that dichotomy right from the start, however unrealistic it seemed. that, hey, this is happening and this is real, and therefore I can actually hope for more real things in my life. So that plays like a very important role in sending Amir out of his home towards his dreams.
Before we sign off, I do have two questions, which is, do you think you're going to return to this world?
I return to thinking about this world a lot, in the sense that I always imagine what Amir would be doing now and how his life would be, because I know that it's not just a simple life. There is also an ethical conundrum that has kind of entered into their lives, because it's something that I don't explore particularly in the Spice Gate, but they are essentially entering into the domain of nature. Right? From civilization, they are going back into nature and they are trampling on nature's space, but they are doing it for their own liberation and freedom. But there is a slight ethical conundrum which I did not explore in the Spice Gate, because for me, the Spice Gate was more about the elimination of oppression. But that is something that I keep thinking about. Like, how does the new society live? How does the new society work? Right? Are there going to be new problems? Are they going to build their new cities and towns which are going to be casteless on forest land? Are they going to kill more animals or destroy more farms? Or how is it going to be? Right? So that's always been a question on the back of my head. And if I ever were to write a book, I always think of it like, yeah, what is going to happen? So I don't know. I wouldn't say no entirely. I might revisit it, but not right now.
Good to know. And that is a very fascinating ethical question, because I hadn't thought of that aspect of it. But you're right. Now they're going to have to build roads and like have to transport all their goods manually. Actually, no, carrying goods through the Spice Gate is also manual, but they're going to actually have to transport this stuff the long way around. So in a way, it's a dawn of civilization as we know it.
Correct. It's almost like this is like the prelude to the far off, the dawn of trade, common trade, and then eventually into industrial revolution and whatnot, only in a society that's a lot more equal for now. We don't know what new inequalities might enter eventually. We always manage to fuck ourselves up.
I was going to say humans are going to human.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah, humans are going to human.
And my other question was, are you working on anything else currently? And also, when will the Spice Gate be out officially?
Let me answer the second question first. The Spice Gate is going to be released in the US on July 16th. It's going to be out in the UK on July the 18th. Anyone living anywhere in the world can order their books on the Amazon US and UK apps, or anywhere else, in terms of the bookstores and all. It will be in due course of time also available in India very soon, but I don't have a fixed date for that yet. The moment I do come to know, I will let everyone know, because the distribution is usually at a lag from when it starts off in the US and eventually comes to India. So, but you can expect it in the bookstore soon enough.
Well, I shall be bragging about the copy that I have, just in the kind of like, hey, you know how you're all waiting? I have one. Anyway, I'm sure that'll make me very popular around town.
Thank you.
But also, as I said, are you working on anything currently?
I'm working on two stories at the moment. One is kind of like a historical fantasy of the ancient history of Tamil Nadu, but it's a fantasy, epic fantasy, which is like a pirate fantasy set around the whole Coromandel coast and, the spice route of the coast, which was once upon a time an inspiration for the Spice Gate in an entirely different way. That is one of the books. And there is also another epic fantasy which was once, whose bare bones I had kind of structured long back, almost a decade ago, inspired heavily on all your Western-centric, European-centric fantasies, but this one very, very, very close to my heart. And I hope that both of them get written soon and see the light of day sometime.
I have the biggest smile on my face at the idea of like a Coromandel Coast Pirates fantasy book. I'm so excited to read it. Thank you so much for being a guest on Arcx, Prashanth. It was such a pleasure chatting to you, and congratulations again on the Spice Gate.
Thank you so much, Anjali.
You can follow Prashanth on Twitter, where he's at Prashatsa. I'm going to spell that out so there's no confusion. Prashatsa. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and show notes.